Most politicians go into politics to try and make the world a better place. We might not agree on what better place looks like, right? But that's where they go for it. It's about the system. And the system wraps everyone up into the same scenario. So take this, for instance, right? There's something in politics called the usual channels. This is like the place where the opposition and the government talk to each other about how they plan the stages of a bill. Now, that's where they decide how little time a bill gets to be scrutinised. And they make that decision together all the time. And the opposition agree with the government on whether they're going to do that. Doesn't matter whether that happens to be Labour or the Conservatives at any given moment. They are wrapped up together in a system that discourages scrutiny, discourages specialist knowledge, deep subject knowledge, and instead sort of worships speed and grandstanding and machismo, which leads us to very, very suboptimal legislative outcomes. So no, they're all as bad as each other, but it's not about their motivation, it's about the system.
It's about the system. Okay, look, I mean, you describe yourself as a liberal extremist. Is there anything liberal extremist about your diagnosis here? Would somebody who wasn't an extreme liberal come to a different conclusion?
No, the values that I assume is that we all think that ideas are improved if they're challenged. You know, if you want to do something about housing, the best thing you can do is have a bunch of experts sit there and go, okay, here are the problems with what you're trying to do. And you can address those problems, you can deal with them before it's implemented, you can hear about them after it's implemented. And that's how we pass better legislation. It's how we make the world better for the people in this country. We have a system that refuses to do that at every stage. Even if you look at the civil service, right? Look at the civil servants. Civil servants move jobs about as often as the ministers do. About every 2 years. That's the only way to get a pay rise, so you move on. So let's say one of them sits there and goes, I've been doing rail contract negotiations for the last 10 years. Like, that guy won't have got a pay rise for the last 10 years. So suddenly he thinks, well, if I'm going to be able to actually make any money, I've got to go off into this completely different area. So even when it comes to someone accidentally picking up expertise so they could scrutinise the ideas that we've got, we encourage them to just become another generalist, another kind of professional amateur. And that is exactly what our system's full of.
So how would you map then this diagnosis onto the political chaos of, for example, the last year, where we've been not underserved by political chaos? So how does this fit? How does this fit then?
So let's take, for instance, the Stop the Boats issue, right? What is the Stop the Boats issue, ultimately? It's about processing asylum claims. Now, the people that came over in the boats last year, we've processed less than 1% of the claims that have come in from that cohort, okay? That system is just not working. Why is it not working? We don't have specialist knowledge in the people making those decisions. We don't pay them properly. We have huge turnover rates in the people that are supposed to make those decisions. So the system just freezes up and stops. And then what do you get? Wave after wave of announcements. I promise if I do this, we'll stop the boats. I promise if we do that, we'll stop the boats. No, just process the claims. Just make the British state work. You can say the same thing for housing. I mean, in the last 23 years, we've had 23 housing ministers. Like, you're just like, what? We have no housing policy.
How many years?
Over the last 23.
23 years.
Some of them have lasted for more than 1 year, but the average 10 year is 1 year. Grant Shapp's made it 2 years.
We've had about 7 over the last 4, haven't we?
We've had a lot. Yeah. I mean, look, between 2021 and 2022, we had 5 health secretaries. We had 3 education secretaries. And you even take something like justice, right? So, in justice, you always have this to and fro between a liberal position and between an authoritarian position. Prison works versus let's get rid of short-term sentences and help people into work, right? Even there, within the same government, you get this extraordinary turnover, right? You start with Ken Clarke in 2010. He has a liberal position. You go over to Chris Grayling, he has an authoritarian position. You go back to Michael Gove, he has a liberal position. Liz Truss, an authoritarian position. Back to David Gauke, a liberal position. So there's no policy, right? Let's say one of these 2 positions is right. We'll never know because we never allow anyone to stay in place for long enough to actually implement the policy.
It's a bit like the whole sort of real communism has never been tried. Real anything has never been tried.
Real government.
Real government has never been. I mean, does this lead us then to figures like Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, who are basically they're just policy announcements, right? They're just policy announcements who engage very loosely with the real world, and when they're forced to, everything falls apart.
Yeah, I mean, Liz Truss has a terrible reputation of being a very supreme example of someone who doesn't have any interest in the evidence that she's presented with. There's a story from Sam Freeman, who was serving as a civil servant at the time, or a policy advisor at the time, where you talk about this thing that civil servants sometimes do, and they try to box in a minister, but they know what they want to do. The minister's changing every, 9 months, 1 year, so they're like, okay, let's just get this guy out of the way. So they think, look, we've put 5 ideas down, 4 of them are completely mad, 1 of them is the one you obviously want to take, and you just say, the minister will sign off on that. So they tried doing that with Liz Truss, and she just kept on picking the maddest option every single time.
Okay, look, this book, it's not all negative. There are bits you say of Westminster that do work. Tell us about some bits of Westminster that do work, in your opinion.
Yeah, so the select committees work. And that's an interesting thing, right? Like, why do they work? Because they're not hyper-partisan. right? They're working in a collegiate way. You've got a chair at the front who's not just like an impartial referee like the Speaker in the Commons. They're actually trying to find consensus. They're taking evidence. They're listening to experts. And what do they find? That actually you can come up with some really practical, pragmatic solutions that can get cross-party support as long as we're incentivizing people to think in terms of moderation and compromise and empiricism rather than just hyper-partisanship and screaming matches. The other part that works, and no one likes this, is it's the House of Lords.
What sort of liberal are you?
I mean, the truth is it just works really well. And that's not because, so the bit that we always look at, right, is Prime Minister putting in, a party donor or a Russian asset. And we're like, well, no, that's not okay. So we should strip the Prime Minister of the power to do any of that. But the part that we don't talk about is the crossbench peers. Mm-hmm. And the crossbench peers, people who've got a considerable amount of experience and accomplishment in their life, in the sciences, in the arts, in business, in volunteering, they're put there. You can't bribe them. You can't push them around. There's nothing you're going to be able to say or do to them that's going to make them go against their judgment. They know exactly how the system operates. So suddenly you put a bill on benefits in front of them. It's like the first time the government's ever looked at it. You just get these very senior people going, no, that's not going to work because you haven't done this. And you know what? You've got no government majority in the House of Lords. So you're actually going to have to listen to us now unless you want this thing to die. So those two parts, Select Committees, House of Lords, they work. And they are the two bits that are non-partisan, that are based on specialist knowledge, and that actually seek to improve legislation rather than just forcing it through.
Is there a sense in that case in which your book could be understood as a sort of manifesto for technocracy?
Right. I would say the opposite, right? So you look at the way the House of Commons works. There's no democracy in the manner in which we do it. We don't even count 2/3 of the votes that we have for MPs coming in because they're either for someone that didn't win or they're for the person that did win after the point that they got through. First past the post, as our electoral system does, is it's designed, it's literally for this, to give one party on a minority of the vote a huge amount of executive power through a huge thumping majority, okay? Now, that is a democratic argument, but it's also an argument about scrutiny because once you've got a huge majority, you can just do whatever you like. You don't have to listen to opposition parties. You don't have to take their concerns on board. Take the way that we see legislation passed in Scotland. So very similar political culture. It's not like they're less angry or less tribal than we are. But because you've got a proportional system, they have to take opposition views on board. And legislation, even poor legislation, for instance, the recent one on hate crimes, is improved by having to take on the views of your critics. So actually, by having more democracy in the Commons, we could have a more effective scrutiny system for legislation.
Let's talk about the role of cabinet ministers, particularly. Your book starts with Chris Grayling.
Yes, I'm sorry about that.
Often dubbed Failing Grayling. How unique was he as a cabinet minister? Because your position is that he's not unique at all. He's just someone in which the world has noticed that this wasn't working.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Yeah. And over we see that. We just don't talk very much about junior ministers, right? But, but suddenly when someone's senior, Chris Grayling or Dominic Raab, we're like, oh, how can someone with such little knowledge or understanding get to the senior? Right, no, because overwhelmingly they have this little knowledge or understanding. There's no requirement at all that they should understand the thing that they're doing when they're put in charge of it. That fact alone, really should make us think again. In what kind of other job would you not have to demonstrate some knowledge of the area that you're going to be working in or some experience of it? That is simply not a criteria in reshuffles. There's lots of interviews in the book with civil servants, especially cabinet secretaries, who were there around the Prime Minister during a reshuffle going, look, hang on a minute. This guy just doesn't actually know anything about this subject matter. If you're going to do that, at least put a junior minister who has some background in prisons or whatever. They never do that because the incentive behind a reshuffle is securing prime ministerial authority. It's basically saying, reward loyalists, penalise those who aren't, and try and balance the party. That's just not what you're going to do if you want people that know what they're talking about.
Is there a way to solve that problem? Is there some other system where you have... it drifts into sounding a bit like the American system where you have appointees from the top down who are then verified by committees, right?
Yeah, which, by the way, is not a bad idea. And loads of European countries have something similar. You allow the Prime Minister to select people from outside of the talent pool that's available in Parliament. Right, so so in the US, if you have someone in charge of defence, you very often have a 4-star general. In the UK, you get Gavin Williamson, right? That is a problem, right? Just limiting the talent pool in that way. But the rest of it has to be about changing the incentives. Also, I have to say the electoral system has an impact there too. It's where you have coalition, as we did in 2010, you have people staying in cabinet for a longer period because it's kind of the result of these quite contorted negotiations between the parties. It's harder to just get rid of people in that way. So these are the things that you can do to make sure you have more security and also to demand it of politicians. To have it as part of your political culture of being like, no, we expect people to actually have some seriousness about them if they're going to decide that they're going to govern us. We want evidence of that. And yet we never demand that, and you don't see any of that even being discussed in newspapers, let alone being a criteria for selection.
Remind people about Michael Barber and the delivery unit, which you write about in your book.
Yeah. So this is a positive story, and it's one of those stories of one of the rare moments that an expert did find their way into Downing Street almost by mistake, right? So it's Blair's second term, and all we talked about at the time Blair's second term was Iraq, right? Iraq. In the background, they set up a system to make sure that they could deliver on the promises they made at the election. Promises on health, promises on education, promises on transport. Michael Barber was the person in charge of that. He ran something called the delivery unit. The purpose of the delivery unit was to set manageable targets, to come up with, to make sure that those targets were reflective of an overall improvement in the institution. So why did we have, for instance, limits on how long you could wait at A&E? It was because that would indicate the health of the NHS in general, because if you can keep that wait short at A&E, it means the wards are getting filled out, it means we're getting rid of people from the wards. It's exactly the problem that we've had now, that all of that has fallen apart. He was non-macho. He had a sort of curiosity of an academic sort. He didn't have the whole Malcolm Tucker running around shouting at everyone. It was, if we have a meeting, I'm going to speak to you clearly, but I want both of us to leave this with our relationship in a better place. And what he got was results. Like, you even take train performance in October, right? Like, why do trains not perform in October? Well, we all know the answer, because there's leaves on the line. Okay, Michael Barber was one of the first people to go, okay, well, I understand that, but what I don't get is why you're surprised that leaves fall from trees. Right? And so they started saying, well, let's go to different countries and find out how it works. And in places like Poland, they used resin on the tracks to prevent the trains skidding. You could use that data, that evidence, to improve the performance of trains here. All you need is to stop thinking in terms of just dogma and partisanship and think in terms of evidence and compromise.